North America has some of the most abundant wildlife in the world. With roughly 640 million acres of public land in the U.S. and countless acres of private habitat, citizens can enjoy seeing and even interacting with wildlife quite often compared to other parts of the globe. I want to spend the next 5 minutes outlining what makes our continent so unique with its wild inhabitants and places. More specifically, I want to detail the role legal hunting has played in restoring and conserving North American wildlife. First, let's detail what I mean by legal hunting. During this video, I'll refer to hunting as the practice of licensed individuals harvesting game animals within the laws of their state. I won't get into poaching, which is any sort of hunting that does not follow the strict rules put in place by the state, or trophy hunting, which would have to be its own video. Instead, I'll discuss hunting in the way the vast majority of hunters experience it: legal and regulated. Let's start with some background. In the 1800s, several factors, mainly unregulated market hunting, were causing the decline and for some the extinction of many species. According to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, in the early 1900s, the elk population had dropped to an estimated 41,000. Due to conservation efforts, today the population estimates exceed 1 million. In the same time frame, turkey populations rose from 100,000 to 7 million, pronghorn populations went from 12,000 to 1.1 million, and white-tailed deer rose from 500,000 to an estimated 32 million. So, what happened in the early 1900s that led to this dramatic increase in wildlife? To sum it up, we created and implemented the North American model of wildlife conservation. This model is what we can thank for having abundant wildlife on the landscape. And whether you hunt or not, isn't that what we all want? The North American model of wildlife conservation is based on 7 principles. First, wildlife is a public trust resource, entrusted to the state to manage. This means that unlike, say, England, where wildlife is the property of whoever's land it happens to be standing on, here, all wildlife belongs to everyone, or no one, depends on how you look at it. The second principle prohibits a market for wild game. Remember how market hunting almost destroyed wildlife? This is why it's illegal to sell the salmon you caught or the deer jerky you made. Number 3, the allocation of wildlife by law. This means the state, not landowners, allocates the tags and determines what wildlife can be taken by hunters. Number 4, wildlife may only be killed for legitimate purpose, food being the main purpose. This is why if someone goes and shoots a buck and only takes the horns, they're not a hunter, they're a poacher. That's illegal. Number 5, wildlife is recognized as an international resource. This is particularly important for migratory birds that spend certain parts of their year in different countries. The North American model of wildlife conservation recognizes the need for international cooperation in the conservation of wildlife. As a science nerd, number 6 is one of my favorite principles. Science is the appropriate tool for wildlife policy. This means wildlife biologists and ecologists should determine hunting and fishing regulations. This is why ballot box biology, like voting for the reintroduction of wolves or decreasing restrictions of wolf hunting, which happened recently in Colorado and Idaho respectively, is inherently a bad idea. Let's leave the science to the scientists. And the last principle, my personal favorite, the democratic allocation of wildlife. This ensures all citizens have equal opportunity to harvest wildlife, regardless of wealth or land ownership. It's also the reason why a lowly peasant such as myself can feed my family on the cleanest, leanest organic meat that nature has to offer, all by hunting on public land. Now that you're familiar with the current model of wildlife management, why should you care? You don't hunt. Wildlife is doing great. All is good, right? Well, kinda. According to the Department of the Interior, over 101 million people participated in wildlife activities in 2016. So hunting, fishing, but also hiking, birdwatching, and recreation. That's 40% of the US population. The same report stated only about 4.5% of the population hunt. So a large portion of the population utilizes wildlife, and a very small portion of the population hunts. Here's why this is concerning. According to Winkler et al., through the sales of licenses and taxes from the Pittman and Roberts Act, hunters give $1.3 billion annually to wildlife conservation. That's 65% of the Wildlife Agency budgets. Quick side note, the Pittman and Robertson Act was created by sportsmen in 1939 as a self-imposed 11% tax on firearms and hunting equipment, and it has raised more than $14 billion that can only be used for wildlife conservation. I mention this because Winkler also stated that only about 3% of residents were aware that revenues from federal excise taxes on firearms and ammunition supported conservation. So, how do we balance the practicality of hunting-based revenue with the newer ideologies of the environmental movement? Sociologist Nels Poulsen attempts to open a dialogue between the two user groups, stating that sustainable hunting should be incorporated into global conservation. However, higher levels of trust are needed between the two user groups. It seems paradoxical that hunters can care deeply about wildlife and nature, even though they're willing to occasionally kill and eat animals. But regardless of one's beliefs about hunting, we're all on the same side, with similar goals: clean air and water, pristine habitat, abundant wildlife, and healthy biodiversity. Hopefully, this video has given you a better understanding of how wildlife is managed, where conservation dollars come from, and the role of hunting in regulating wildlife.